Ben Qualo, Midwest Games, founder and CEO. We are mainly here to kind of talk about Rah Rah Boom, to talk about Duck Paradox, which we just released into early access on last Thursday. And so super excited to kind of show off our catalog of titles and then talk about kind of some future titles that are coming down the line.
So, Rah Rah Boom, we saw it last year. What's going on with that game? What's new with it? Like, it's a long process. Games take a long time to make.
Oh, an incredibly long time to make. And so what's happening is they're in it. They're getting ready for a release hopefully this year and working through, what are the elements that we can refine the most to create the best possible gameplay experience. And so we already have a really core loop, and they're really working on kind of finishing out that process right now.
So talk about some of the difficulties when, running a studio and being a CEO of a company that makes video games in 2024.
Yeah, especially a video game publisher, where we get to work with so many different developers. Obviously, it's a really kind of interesting time in the industry and a lot of dynamic things happening. But there's so much talent all throughout the world. And so what we're really focused on is looking at, well, how do we bring more opportunities to talent in underrepresented places? And so we're finding developers in non-traditional places. Rah Rah Boom is a studio called Guiley Games in Cincinnati, Ohio. But we're working with another studio in Ohio, a studio in Wisconsin, a studio in New Mexico, a studio in Mexico. And we're talking with developers from all around the world about possibilities on how do we best support games as they kind of go to market, as they need those support mechanisms, because all the data shows that you need a partner, whether it be a publisher or some other form, to help you go to market. That elevates you above the 14,000 games that are coming out on Steam every year. It makes a huge difference. And so how do we best support those folks, especially folks that don't traditionally get the support, that aren't in San Francisco, LA, Seattle, Austin? How do we get those and elevate them into market?
Is it hard balancing the business side with the creative side for a video game publisher? Because I know that's an everyday challenge for you, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is an everyday challenge. I like to think of myself as a half creative. So I understand creative enough, but I know what I don't understand, and I understand the business end as well. And so it's marrying up two things. I like to call it like a healthy friction, where both sides are trying to get the best product out and working together. And that doesn't always align day to day. And so how do you work through that? How do you provide feedback? And so that is a huge piece of what we're aiming to do, and how we're aiming to do it is working with creators and enabling their vision, but pushing back on the things that might actually hinder them as they're going to market.
I mean, they still have to have deadlines. There's still a budget, right? It's not indefinite. You have to meet, your agreed to publishing responsibilities.
Yeah, exactly. You ultimately, there are requirements that come along with this, but it's all for the best. It is, if you're doing it right, it's for the best of the game. It's going to help the game, even if sometimes it feels like you can't do everything you want. But we never can do everything we want. It's just the reality of life. You're not going to be able to do every single thing creatively of vision, at least on the first one. Now, if you succeed with the first game, you can then expand upon that. You can then grow it. So some of it is de-scoping some things, at least initially, so that you can find a more narrow path to go to market and then expand it. If there's an audience there that is really excited about that, awesome. Tell more stories in it. Expand the gameplay experience. But you don't have to do all of that, in the first game. It's not your last game that you're ever going to make. It's just the next game, and then there's going to be a game after that. And so how do you expand upon your learnings from one game to the next game?
From an outsider looking in, what do you think is the biggest misconception about being a CEO of a game publishing company?
That I get to play games all the time. It's mainly meetings with lawyers and investors, negotiating contracts, and a lot of the difficult conversations that come up, because even when you have the best of intent to kind of work with a developer to bring that game to market, it doesn't always feel good when you're going through a contract. If 20 pages of a publishing agreement with all the legalese that is involved. And so a lot of my role is maintaining a great relationship throughout that process, because ultimately, as much as we have to go through that, we both are in it for the right reasons. And so where we always like to start is them knowing our intent before we ever put that contract in front of them, and knowing what we're trying to do. And if anything in that contract doesn't feel like the intent that we laid out at the beginning, we want them to call it out and say, hey, I don't feel good about this, or I need more details on that. And that's okay. That creates a healthy dialogue, healthy relationship between developer and publisher.
It's 2024. Has the industry changed in the last the industry has changed in the last decade or so, especially with how many games you released on Steam every week at this point, over 100 per week. How do you guys gauge when you're approached by an independent developer, or when you're looking for an independent developer and decide to sign them and help them out?
Oh yeah, it's changed dramatically. We've moved from 10 years ago. It was still like a lot of physical in the environment, and now we're like a fully digital world. In fact, the next thing is probably going to be this cloud world, 5 to 10 years from now. And so engaging developers has really changed in that they can more easily, more quickly send us information through. So, and we don't have to sit down. Like, I think 10 years ago, you had a lot of in-person meetings. You had you went through and spent time with everybody. You had dinners. You had all of these other things that were going on, and it wasn't necessarily always about the game. Like, it was about the relationship,
right.
Like somebody you knew. And I think what's happening now is more people are getting access more quickly to publishers that they didn't know before, or investors that they didn't know before. And so that accessibility is becoming really interesting. And then with the technology that's coming around it, people can more easily visualize their idea on a pitch deck. And that used to be really difficult. You'd have to have concept artists coming through and trying to give that style, and trying to also sell that through to a publisher and visualize it. And now they can really do that with a lot of technology.
At what point do you see, you see different games at different stages all the time, but do you prefer, when you look at games, do you want like a game jam? Do you pitch clients, well, show me something concrete, we'll come back to it at a later time? Like, how do you gate, I guess my question is, how do you judge a game that wants to be published by your company?
It's so complex. It is a combination of really, you have to have a gut feel for some of this, but then looking at, some of the data and the realities, what kind of genre is it? Like, that's an indicator. Some people might follow that too strongly, but, it is absolutely an indicator. Comp titles that have done and gone to market, what is that range? Like, what is the low end? What is the high end? Knowing what your ceiling is per game that could be going out is a good sell to the publisher, because we go, okay, well, it's a indie game in the space that sold 20 million units. Wow, that's a lot. And so even if it comes close to that, it just shows that there is a market available. But you also have to look at the team makeup. For us, it's the alignment of culture, diversity of the team, and then where they're based is a piece. Yeah, exactly. And so looking for people from other places is a big piece of it. And we'll still look at folks in San Francisco or Austin, but the reality is those places are so expensive, it raised the price of the game to a point that we, as a smaller publisher, can't afford to fund some of those projects. And so we more naturally gravitate towards these other places. And then there's a whole host of other factors that kind of come into play. Timeline, like if we have 4 titles, in a certain window, adding another title into that without me then having resources against that title is going to be really tough. And we want to be careful about adding too many resources, because then what about when we have one title in the next window? We don't want to have to then, ultimately figure out how we reassess those resources over time. And so we have to be really cautious with how we're approaching it. So we're thinking about the windows, the timing, and then ultimately really that team makes up a big difference in our kind of equation.
Also, sometimes games can be a very slow burn. It's great when you have your Pal Worlds and they sell, 5 million copies in 3 days. That's awesome. But some of those games take a while to get noticed and pick up. Among Us was on the market for years before people found that game out.
Yeah, ultimately giving a game its chance in market, continuing to try to support it over time. There's so many different sales over time, because any one of those could suddenly be that moment. Some YouTuber suddenly goes, whoa, this game that released, I didn't discover it until this sale. It was suddenly like $4.99, and now I love this game. It's one of the best deals ever. And suddenly that title can have its moment. And so there's a long tail on this. Some games sell 10 plus years. Having worked at 2K on a game like Civilization 3 and 4 still sells, even though there's 5 and 6, and it still continues to sell over time. And so that's the exciting thing about a lot of these games, is they do have this long tail over time, but you have to give it a chance, and you have to continue to put it on sale and put it in bundles and trying to get that exposure. And all it takes sometimes is one person playing it with the right audience, and it can blow up into something bigger.
What do services like Game Pass open up for you as a publisher, where it's kind of like a no-risk trial to be put in a library of other games? Does that help you as a publisher? Does it hurt you?
I see it as a strong exposure play. It generates so much awareness, and I think we're going to see the rise of subscription services, having come from Netflix and Netflix games and been part of the build of that. I saw it firsthand of what this future place could be. If you think about the streaming world and what is happening streaming, where there's the whole streaming wars and all of that stuff, which is a bit, overblown, but at the same point, we're going to see some of that happen in games, or at least people try, because bundling a bunch of games into one, as much as certain gamers only want to play certain games, which is fine, there's 3.8 billion gamers. There's something for everybody, and some people do want to play a lot of games and do want to try a lot of games. And those kinds of portfolio subscription services allow for your game to get a further exposure, which helps on that platform and other platforms, because a lot of these games are multi-platform. And so when something is on, Xbox Game Pass, it's still selling on Steam. And if you're a Steam player and not an Xbox player, you're going to potentially buy it on Steam at that point.
Porting costs are not cheap, and usually you have to outsource that if the original developer is not, well-versed in porting. How do you look at porting as a CFO of a publisher, like in terms of a PC only? Then if it does well, you port afterwards? Like, how do you gauge when you want to spend that money to put it on Switch, put it on Xbox, put it on PlayStation?
Yeah, I believe that in order to be a more sustainable industry, you have to take a more cadenced approach to releasing the game. It starts PC as a really strong, easy access, and you can see, is there an audience for something? And then being able to bring it to multiple platforms over time, being able to bring it to Xbox or PlayStation or Switch, or any of those premium mobile services as well, with Netflix and what they're doing, and I expect there to be a lot more in that space over time. And so being able to bring it to each is awesome, because it's another exposure moment, it's another marketing moment. Because again, like if you're a PlayStation user and it's already been released on PlayStation, but then you see it came to Xbox, it might remind you, oh yeah, I wanted to play that game, or I wanted to buy that game, and now I'm reminded of that and I go and do it. And so it helps every other platform over time, but you have to be a little bit more patient. You can't build an IP overnight, which I think is more valuable. I'm a huge fan of like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was a black and white comic and built over time, right? It took 40 years of building, and they've only just recently had their biggest success from a movie standpoint. They've had a successful game lately. And so building IP slower, I think, is a more valuable, ultimately long-term approach, but you have to be patient.
I've been in the industry for 10 years, and I've met a lot of high-profile IPs, and all of them say the same thing. You'd be surprised, the game does not sell itself.
No. Well, it's an iterative process. If you look at every single Game of the Year candidate this last year, it was all an iteration. It was not the first version of something. Everything kind of blows up over time. You look at Helldivers, Helldivers 1 it did okay, but that same team iterated, thought about it differently, approached it a little bit differently, put out Helldivers 2, and that blew up into something. So give it something a chance by starting a little bit smaller scope. I think what I was saying a little bit earlier, like smaller scope out the gate, but then iterate on it. Like, what were the things that the players really loved about it that you can then give them more? And then you also are not starting from zero, you're starting from a core that already is aware of this game, and then you can build it into this larger piece.
Say I'm a small independent developer, I don't know, in Idaho or Utah. Like, what advice would you give to that person, not necessarily for you, but just to get the publisher's attention, to get the funding they need to complete their passion project?
Network. You have to network, you have to connect into the industry. I think that's one of the biggest challenges is when you're not in one of these traditional places, you don't know how to do it. I utilize LinkedIn. Like that is where I find a great network of people. And there are people there that want to help developers. And so reaching out, connecting with those publishers, that network of people. It could be another developer and then they know a publisher and then they connect you into it. And so really building out the network before you need to talk to a publisher is great, because if you already know somebody and then you go, hey, like we've known each other a while, like I actually have this game, that's a much easier, warmer intro into kind of talking to a publisher. But you have to do some legwork up front, or network with other developers. They know, and they can also advise, like this publisher has this kind of deal, this publisher has this kind of deal, and and whatever they think is kind of best for what game that they're making.
How do you guys utilize early access, and what do you take away from that? I mean, it's valuable. It's such a valuable tool, but how do you use it specifically?
I mean, ultimately it allows you to go to market and kind of evaluate or have the consumer evaluate the game and call out the things that might not be perfect about it, and you actually have the room to be like, yeah, you're right, it's not perfect, it's early access, let's fix those things, iterate on them so that we can eventually get to launch. So it allows you in so many ways to have a group of engaged testers that are also paying for the game at a cheaper price point, which is, I think, beneficial for them to be able to come into something early. And so there's a lot of incredible titles that are in early access that some of them seem to never be leaving early access, but ultimately it is really incredible way to go to market that allows a consumer to know this game is not finished. Whereas when you put something out that is supposedly like finished, when there's bugs, when there's issues, which is inevitable because games are so complex to make, it just allows you to set things up the right way and then have a ramp up to an actual full launch.
And then just another fun question is, as CEO, what do you think is the hardest part about your job, aside from not getting any sleep?
Well, you can probably see that within the bags in my eyes. No sleep. The hardest part is like, you want each one of these to succeed. Like, cause I get to work with, right now we're engaged with like 20 different developers, and we're only signed some of them, but you want each one of those to actually succeed. So you ultimately, like in your mind, go through the path to success. And what's tough is sometimes when you're like, you have to let something go, or it doesn't, achieve what you want it to. It's really hard to accept that because you get so invested in each of these different titles, and you really want to see them succeed out in market. And so it's sometimes you get those really down days if something's not quite living up to what you wanted it to be.
When do you, I'm not sure if it's your decision or your CFO's or another person's decision, but when do you decide to be like, okay, we have to stop marketing, we have to move on to the next project, we have to take the L?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, at least how I'm approaching my company now, I'm making the call because ultimately I have to be accountable and responsible for those decisions, and be the captain of that and take that pressure off of my team. And it's tough to make those calls, but ultimately I want especially the developer to know who they can go to, who can have an open, honest discussion with them. I think that's just the really important piece of this is just the transparency, and no matter what, it can be difficult to hear those things, and it's not the thing you want to hear in the moment, but my hope always is that over the long span they at least respect like the fact that they made the call, was honest about the call, and it just, for us, we're trying to avoid getting in those situations by having just successful launches.
Accountability in this economy as CEO? What nonsense is that?
Yeah, it's one of my frankly issues with how some things are approached is we have to be accountable, and it's being vulnerable, and I make mistakes all the time, and like a lot of people make mistakes, and the more you can just be like, hey, that was my bad, you can learn from it, grow from it, and then the next thing is better. And that's something, one of the core tenets of Netflix that I think was so valuable to me, really growing and learning in that environment, is just taking accountability and say it when you fail or when you're wrong about something, because you have an opportunity for growth in that moment, which is one of the most valuable things you can do.
So like what's, you mentioned, you know, we talked about Raw Boom a little bit, you have another game entering early access. What's next for your company that you can talk about?
So what's next? We have Dark Sky coming later this year, which is really, really exciting for us. And we have a number of other ones. So we're right now in the process of we're evaluating a couple more titles for this year and then a number of titles for next year. We're also talking through potential other kinds of deals and unique approaches to how we launch things, how we work in the physical space. You know, we're so digital now. I think there's actually a lot of opportunities in the physical space with these titles. And so we're looking at a lot of deals on how do we take something that we're putting out and expand it into other areas as well. Because I think that's the best way you can support a developer, because that then, if they're able to expand that audience into other areas, that then gives them a better chance for a second game if they want to make a second game, and kind of expanding the overall IP of over time.
I think the biggest thing on my end, just doing this for so long, is I see so many games come and go, and they could do everything right and still not make it. And I think that's just so infuriating on both a business side and a dev side, because you're like, I made a great game, it was great, but you know, anything could become a factor. Launch time, you know what I mean? A last minute date change for a AAA game can smash you out of stuff. You know, if Steam changes policies, or you have to do something in certification that changes it, or just the year of release, month of release, day of release, it all comes into thing. It's so much on the entire, it's a huge production. I don't think people realize that.
Yeah, the reality is a piece of this business is luck. Like timing and what's happening in the environment, it can hurt you, it can help you, and you just have to accept that at times. But it's one of the hardest things to accept, because you want to control as much as you possibly can, but the reality is a big piece of this is out of your control. And so, you know, for me, I talk with my team a lot, like, let's control what we can control, and then the rest, like, is a bit out of our hands, and we just have to know that. But there's still lessons to be learned even in those situations. How can you improve? How can you avoid that? How can you be more aware of what other games are coming out at certain times? Because there are calendars and there's shared resources, and a lot of industry folks will actually share that amongst themselves, because it ultimately helps everybody. If they don't want, they also don't want to be on top of somebody else. And so ultimately it's sometimes a little bit of a dance, but it's a real opportunity at the same point.